Welcome to the inaugural episode of DiaLogos, Conversations on Human Life and Letters at Thales College. I'm Peter Forrest, I'm the provost at Thales College, and this is a new series of video interviews we'll be doing with interesting people, at least people we think are interesting, discussing great thinkers, writers, works, and ideas. For episode 1, we were joined by one of our very own, actually, Dr. Anthony Esolen, Distinguished Professor of the Humanities at Thales College. And the topic of our discussion was Shakespeare as Christian, the Christian themes in the plays of William Shakespeare. Now, when we think of Shakespeare, do we think of him as a distinctively Christian poet and playwright? I'd venture to guess that for most of us, the answer is no. And there could be a number of reasons for this. Perhaps this is just because Shakespeare, unlike other great poets of the Christian era, such as Dante and Milton, never wrote an explicitly theological work like the Divine Comedy or Paradise Lost. And maybe it's his penchant for bawdy, off-color humor. Or perhaps there's something deeper going on. Perhaps it's because we see Shakespeare as too quintessentially modern in his themes and sensibilities, and too celebrated in the modern age to be anything other than a thoroughly secular writer. We reflexively assume, in other words, that anyone who enjoys universal acclaim and speaks so universally to people in our own day must be secular in his outlook. It's just a theory. I don't know if that's right or not. But in any event, here to set the record straight about the Christian Shakespeare is Professor Esolen.
Right. I'm wondering if you can just start us off by introducing us a little bit to the life and times of William Shakespeare, and do we know much or anything about his own personal faith?
Well, his father was a recusant Catholic. He paid the fine, so to speak, that you would have to pay if you weren't attending Anglican services. There was a certain, you would have to expect roadblocks in whatever career you took, and you'd be penalized for it a little bit financially. And Shakespeare's father preferred to pay the fine. Shakespeare's family on the mother's side, the Ardens, were recusant Catholics also. So Shakespeare grows up in this in the midst of not just conflict between the churches, but a struggle to understand what exactly the Word of God implies for your being a member of a church, or you being a Christian generally. You had not just the Anglicans, but a kind of radical left wing among what we would call now, I suppose, Protestants, who believed that these were kind of breakaway sects that that you were already made holy and you could dispense with most law. Okay, the family of love, for instance, a notorious example. But then you also had radicals who believed that the Anglican Church was too compromised by adopting most of the liturgical forms of the Roman Church and preserving the episcopacy.
So would this be who we would call the Puritans today?
Yeah, Puritans, some Puritans who accepted episcopacy, and Puritan was an insult word, just like Gothic was invented as an insult word by the Renaissance people looking back on medieval architecture and saying it's fit for barbarians. Of course, it implied that they didn't understand the architecture. The Puritans didn't go around themselves calling them Puritans because that would be snobbish and prideful. Their enemies call them that way, sarcastically. And the Puritans were a thorn in the side of the ordinary Anglican church that wanted to have peace, wanted to keep the Catholics out. I mean, you could be executed if you were a Catholic priest in England. If you found out that you had celebrated Mass, you could be drawn and quartered. That is, they'd cut open.
Not a good way to go.
No. They'd hang you by the neck, but not till you were dead. See, to be hanged by the neck until dead, that's not redundant. They'd hang you by the neck, but they'd cut you down before you died. And then they'd disembowel you. You would still be a living. You'd see this. They'd throw the bowels onto the fire. You'd expire, and then they'd cut your body up into quarters. So that you'd be drawn, disemboweled, and you'd be quartered. Horrible executions, right? Shakespeare's growing up in the midst of this, and he's got cousins, right? He's got a cousin who's a Catholic priest. He's got cousins on the mother's side who are in this mix too. Maybe some of them have taken part in hiding a priest, right? They used to create spaces inside walls to sneak a priest in. And then the Elizabeth's priest hunters got very good at detecting aberrations in a house's architecture. Typically a manor house. We're talking typically about some well-to-do gentry who held on to the old faith.
Right.
So you're growing up in the midst of this, and you're the smartest poet who ever lived, I think. And you see the need for social order. In fact, you at least nominally accept the Anglican Church. Otherwise, you're not going to be able to work in London. You make your peace with it, and maybe you see, there's nothing that they're actually doing that I disagree with. What they're doing in their services, or the way they pray, that I disagree with. I'm not comfortable about the spying and the execution of priests, but and I do see the need for order. I reject what the Puritans are after. I reject the sneaky Calvinism that's behind some of it. So I'm not with the Scottish Presbyterians. But you're in the midst of this, and you got to think about all of these things.
Yeah.
You got to think about all these things while you're making your career, you're making your money, putting on plays for a general audience,
right,
and becoming very quickly the best loved, most popular playwright in the nation. Winning, in fact, the favor, but always an uneasy kind of favor, of the Queen. And then when Queen dies and King James comes to the throne, you win the favor of the king pretty readily, and you rename your players the King's Men. But Shakespeare is in the midst of this, and he's preoccupied with what we would now call moral theological concerns. What does it mean to be a good human being created by God, okay, with an eternal destiny? What does evil do to the human soul by the very nature of evil and of the human soul? How do we combine in any society true justice with a kind of practical liberty that human beings are going to need? How do you incorporate mercy into justice? How do you save lost human souls if they can be saved? All these questions are like central questions to the drama of human life. And he's examining them all the time. He alludes to scripture far more often than any of his contemporaries do. But it's never in a goody two-shoes kind of way.
So by contemporaries, these contemporary playwrights...
Even Christopher Marlowe writing Dr. Faustus.
Ben Jonson.
Certainly Marlowe. Jonson, who is like Shakespeare, has a kind of funny relationship with the churches. For a while, he too is a recusant Catholic. But other of the contemporaries, the Tudor and Stuart contemporaries, people like his friends, Francis Beaumont, John Fletcher, with whom he collaborated on a couple of plays of theirs, or people like in the next generation, John Ford, not to be confused with the great director. American director. Younger people like Green and Decker, there are a lot of playwrights, right?
Sure.
And nobody does as much by far with these fundamentally theological questions than Shakespeare does.
Again, if you're thinking in comparison, and I'm thinking about the sort of classical education and who are the writers, the early modern writers that people go to, or the medieval and modern writers. And in comparison to people like Dante and Milton, you've got theological questions front and center.
Right, because that's what they're writing about.
Right. And so Shakespeare, as far as I'm aware, doesn't ever write as explicitly theological questions as much. Is that fair to say, or are there explicitly theological questions which are as it were sort of subtly presented, or is it? I mean, any big question is a theological question on some level, but is it more that he's offering a Christian perspective on these big questions about, say, politics and law and the nature of the human person?
He is certainly doing the latter, and sometimes he is, in fact, grappling with what you would call a clear moral theological or social theological question.
Okay.
Right. But since he's not writing a theological poem,
right,
as Dante was or Milton was,
right,
he's putting a play on stage.
Yeah.
And he wants to make money.
Sure.
Right. He has to tell a good story.
Right. If you want to make money, don't just focus on the.
Well, I mean, you can do it, but you can't turn it into a sermon.
Right.
Okay. This is where confessedly Christian people who try to make movies in our time, this is where they fail, because they don't know that they're supposed to be telling a story. They're not preaching a sermon. And Shakespeare understood the difference.
But you think that there are, so just taking, for instance, sort of ideas of sin and grace, and judgment, you think that those
all
ideas...
over the place in Shakespeare.
So let's talk about whether the more explicitly theological ideas or less theological ideas about law and governance and society.
Right.
Where do we see these, of either category, where do we see sort of most prominently these themes coming out in this place?
You see them most prominently in the four great romances, especially the final three, Cymbeline, the Winter's Tale, and the Tempest. Then you see them in peculiar ways in the four great tragedies, King Lear, Othello, Macbeth, and Hamlet, especially in, I think, Hamlet and Macbeth and King Lear. Then you get them in the problem comedies, such as Merchant of Venice, Measure for Measure, and in some of the other comedies that are really broaching pretty serious matters of human self-damnation, of grace, okay, and themes of gratitude, especially, such as in As You Like It, and to a lesser degree in Twelfth Night, Much Ado About Nothing. But when you get used to it, when you begin to see it, then you see that it is really very close to Shakespeare's heart. It really is quite common all over the place, even when he's telling a different kind of story.
So you mentioned, just for our audience, problem plays, problem comedies. So what is that category?
Well, these problem comedies are centrally about conflicts between the letter of the law and mercy, and what grace means, and what is the appropriate response to a gift. How to live in the economy of a gift, rather than an economy of quid pro quo. Whether you're thinking of it either as monetary exchange or exchange of commodities, or as earning what you earn because you've done a certain thing that deserves this as a reward. Okay, that would be the two plays in question there. That would be Merchant of Venice and Measure for Measure. If we're talking about the economy of grace versus the economy of exchange.
Right.
And the exchange is not a gift. The exchange is conceived of as providing something that warrants a payment in return. Then the play would be measure for measure. But how to reconcile mercy with justice, what the difference is between mercy and leniency,
Right.
what the difference is between justice and an application of the letter of the law that becomes inhuman, even absurd, then we look to measure for measure. Its very name comes from Scripture.
Right. Right. Yeah. So maybe you can. So people are probably familiar, at least in broad strokes, more with Merchant of Venice than maybe the Measure for Measure.
Yeah.
Obviously, it's a very famous play, but in what ways do you see what you were just talking about? So the letter of the law taken to the absurd degree, and the difference between mercy and leniency, and so on. Where do you see that in Measures for Measure? What's the basic outline of plot?
Here's the setup. Okay, we've got a city, Vienna. It's a pretty good place to live. There's not a lot of violent crime in Vienna, but it's also a somewhat decadent place to live. So there are bawdy houses, essentially brothels.
Yeah.
Okay. And the Duke of Vienna has been a bit lenient. He's a typical good Shakespearean ruler in this sense. He loves his people and perhaps is too indulgent.
Right.
And he's more scholarly than political. And this kind of tends to get him to duck out of the messiness of politics too much. And he begins the play by saying to his two chief advisors, an older man and a young man, that he's going to retire from Vienna for a while, and he's going to leave them in charge. And one of them, the elder of the two, is like he is, only not as competent. The younger is clearly a Puritan of sorts. Name is Angelo.
Right.
Angel.
Right.
And it's Angelo that the Duke gives principal charge over Vienna when he's gone. And he doesn't tell these two where he's going, right? He doesn't let them in on his plan, but we are let in on the plan because he tells one of the priests who is his advisor, a monk who's his advisor, that things have gotten a little hairy in Vienna. They've got a little decadent. We have most needful laws that curb, they're like bits in the horse's mouth that curb the headstrong steeds of youth. But we've let them slip. Mm. And he's hoping that Angelo, who is more severe than he is, will apply the laws. And the monk says, well, why didn't you apply them yourself?
Right. Yeah.
And he says, in me, it would have seemed like tyranny. Because when you let people get away with something for so long, it's as if you approved it. Yeah. And that's not consistent.
Right, so this is every teacher knows this from the classroom. This is why
that's right.
You're supposed to lay down the letter of the law on day one, and then you can ease off, as opposed to trying what most of us probably fall into, which is to be too nice and then having to do course correction.
And then you're hated.
Right.
Right. Then the people rightly say, well, you let us do these things.
Right.
You implicitly approved them. Mm-hmm. But he also says to the monk that Lord Angelo is a man who scarcely confesses that his blood flows. And essentially, he's also testing him to see whether he will be just or whether he simply appears to be just. And one of the laws in Vienna, as we soon find out, is a law, it's absurdly severe. Everybody in the Elizabethan audience would have recognized this. This law has gone overboard, okay? And it hasn't been applied in a long time. Yeah. But if you get a girl pregnant and you're not married, the punishment is death. It's a capital crime. we learn news about this in a brothel. Lord Angelo has caught this young man who's gotten his girlfriend pregnant, and he has condemned him to death. The young man, my old professor used to say, imagine Romeo and Juliet. The families don't approve. Romeo and Juliet, a little bit older, and Juliet gets pregnant. What happens? It's even more excusable than that, because the young man, Claudio, is betrothed to the young woman, Giulietta. He's betrothed, and they've been waiting for family approval and for some dowry to be forthcoming. So it's a kind of situation that everybody in the Elizabethan audience would have been familiar with.
Sure.
Okay? And we're not talking here about two thoroughly irresponsible people. We're talking about two people who are committed to one another and they want to get married, and it's the family squabbling about money that's gotten in the way. But that squabbling is thought to be temporary. It's going to pass. But in the meantime, they've jumped the gun, so to speak, and now the crime is writ on Giulietta, on her body. She's showing. Claudio does not make light of this. He is ashamed at what he's done. And Shakespeare doesn't make light of it either.
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask. I mean,
nowhere in Shakespeare will you find fornication looked upon with a shrug. And it's a kind of funny thing, because Shakespeare himself, okay, married a woman, Anne Hathaway, who was 7-8 years older than he was. He got her pregnant. All right? They married.
How do we know that?
We know it. We know it from marriage records and from the record of the birth of the child.
Oh, yeah, okay.
Yeah, we know it. By most accounts, it was a successful marriage. I don't know that it was ridiculously happy, but I think they were content. So Claudio is going to suffer a sentence of death. But this is legal, and he has done wrong, and he admits it.
Yeah.
He's not defiant. But the law is overboard. And Claudio asks a friend of his, Lucio, he's described in the Dramatis Personae, Lucio, a fantastic, right? You got Claudio, son of so on, this or that, Duke Valentine, Lucencio, and Lucio, a fantastic. He's a fellow who lives a completely irregular life, right? Part-time soldier, part-time frequenter of places to get drunk and pick up a prostitute.
And is that the connotation of a fantastic, or what's?
No, a fantastic means half crazy person.
Wow.
He does carry a lot of the comic value in the play, and he's fun to have on stage, although he is actually quite wicked. But he's a friend of Claudio, and Claudio says to him, I have a sister. She's beautiful, and she's young, and she's pure. And she has power in her speech to move men's hearts. She's a novice in the convent. Go to her and ask her to go to Lord Angelo and plead with him to spare my life. Now this Isabella is about to join the Sisterhood of St. Clare, notably severe order. And when the rules regarding her speaking to men are revealed to her, right, she says, and is this all? And the answer is, why, is this too much? And she says, no, I desire rather a more severe restraint. So it's this young woman who's beautiful, but in some ways is overdoing a rejection of natural human ways, who this frequenter of brothels and public houses is going to the convent to talk to, and the only reason why I can talk to her personally because she's a novice, to get her to get outside the convent walls to plead to this Puritan over here to spare her brother's life because her brother has not done something that's worthy of death. His brother has gotten girlfriend pregnant, and that was girl that she grew up with, that you used to call each other cousins. They weren't related, but they used to, they were schoolgirls together. And she detests the sin that Claudio has committed. She says, well, let him marry her, she says to Lucio. And Lucio says, well, this is the point. The Lord Angelo is not going to allow it because it's not to the letter of the law. Mm. So now you've got this young woman who is overcommitted to severity, perhaps is rejecting certain passions that she has that are natural to most people, right? To leave that convent to plead the case of a fornicator, her brother, before a man who is outwardly as severe as she is. And even more severe, he's cold and acutely rational. And how do you plead? How do you get to persuade this man? What argument can you possibly use? She says at first, for instance, condemn the fault, but don't condemn my brother. And he says, what? Why, the fault stands condemned already. Mine were the very cipher of a function, if all I did was to condemn the fault and not the actor of it. What am I here? I'm here as a magistrate. The faults, they stand condemned already by God. I've got to do something. I'm a magistrate. I condemn people. That's what I'm charged with doing. I punish actions. Well, obviously can't rest with that. But in the course of her back and forth with Angelo on 2 occasions, he falls for her and begins to desire her sexually, and will propose that he will save Claudio's life if she will go to bed with him. And she says, I'll proclaim you through the city a hypocrite, a black-hearted hypocrite. And he says, Isabella, who would believe you? All right. The man is going to be guilty intentionally, not in fact, but in his intent. He's going to be guilty of rape and murder. How do you save? Now, not say saving Claudio's life, saving him from the chopping block. How do you save Angelo's soul? How do you do it without pitching Isabella into an act of wickedness? How do you do it so that you pull souls that are threatened with destruction out of the fire without breaking a law or bending a law? How do you have both together? The psalm that is read on matins or something, one of the readings out of the Book of Common Prayer for the day on which this play is performed at Windsor Castle before the King James, is the psalm, I believe it's number 84. I may get the number wrong, but it's the psalm with the so-called 4 daughters of God. Mercy and justice have met. Righteousness and peace have kissed.
Embrace, yeah.
And so everybody in James's audience, these were not dumb people. Right. They had this in mind already, and they hear the name of the play, Measure for Measure, and know the Sermon on the Mount. They know what Jesus is talking about. And they know what goes on from there, right? They know, how do you say to your brother, brother, let me take the speck out of your eye? And this is clearly Angelo's relation to Claudio here.
Right.
Let me take the speck out of your eye, when all along there is a plank in your own. How can you see to take the speck out of your brother's eye? Hypocrite. First take the plank out of your own eye, then you can see well enough to take the speck out of your brother's eye. But this is not to say, oh, you know, there's no speck in your brother's eye. Or it's not to say, well, this is just an alternative way of looking at things. There is a speck in your brother's eye, but there's a plank in your own.
Right.
Condemn not lest you be condemned, for with what measure you measure, so shall it be measured out to you.
So do you think that if Angelo wasn't a hypocrite, I mean, is Shakespeare's point, to overly simple here, but is Shakespeare's point against hypocrisy? Do you think that if Angelo wasn't a hypocrite, that Shakespeare would be okay with him condemning Claudio? Or is there something that's a problem?
There's a problem with the law in question, okay? But there is a problem even before Angelo falls for Isabella. There's a problem with Angelo, okay? Lucio says to the Duke, Duke's in disguise, by the way. The Duke is in disguise and is a character throughout the play. So the Duke is watching things transpire. And Lucio says to the Duke, he doesn't know he's the Duke. He thinks he's just talking to this monk. And Lucio says, what about this Duke, it's Lord Angelo? They say his very urine is congealed ice. So the thing that's wrong with Angelo is that he doesn't know himself. He thinks he is a just man. He thinks he is a righteous man. Now, he may all day long talk about the fact that he's a sinner, but he's one of those sorts who, he may say, I know I'm a sinner like everybody, but he thinks he's a righteous man. And he cultivates this appearance of righteousness, not to be a hypocrite.
Right.
But it's obvious to others. He allows it to be obvious to others. And he himself there's a woman who was betrothed to him. He didn't get her pregnant. Her brother was sailing home with a large dowry for her, and the ship was destroyed at sea. The brother was killed, and down went the goods to the bottom of the deep blue sea. And when that happened, Angelo dumped the girl. This we learn in the middle of the play. But she still has this love for him. And he treated her in a shabby way. And said afterwards, to justify it, it was because he found her too flighty, too much levity, too loosey-goosey. So he slanders her to boot. She becomes drawn into the play, and here's the question. How do you save Claudio's life? How do you save Angelo's soul? How do you keep Isabella from committing sin? How do you make good for this young woman, Mariana, whom Angelo dumped? How do you bring back a greater social order in Vienna and not end up being despised for it as a tyrant? That's a whole bunch of tricky things to accomplish altogether.
Yeah, and maybe we shouldn't entirely spoil the process. Right. Some people will know the play, but it occurs to me when you talk about that combination of mercy and justice. So not just sort of erasing the law, or not just looking the other way at sin or transgression,
right.
But there being a space to save Claudio's life and Angelo's soul. that the Christian response is going to involve Christ as a mediator.
Right.
And I'm not going to ask the overly sort of simple question, which is, is there a Christ figure in Measure for Measure, or something like that? But the work, I mean, a lot of it, if I'm remembering rightly, comes down to the work of the Duke behind the scenes,
who is acting as a kind of providence.
Right.
Acting providentially.
Yeah. So maybe in broad strokes, what is Shakespeare's answer to those questions that you ask? How do you do this, this, and this? I mean, in the end of the day, he does wrap it up nicely.
The answer is fine. Christ is the answer, okay? Now, on the Elizabethan and the Stuart stage, you were forbidden by law to utter the name of God. After a certain point, you could not utter the name of God or the name of Christ.
Wow.
Okay? Because it was considered not fit, there. Therefore, if you were going to refer to God or Christ, you had to do it by a circumlocution. Okay. But it's clear, for instance, in the play The Merchant of Venice, that Christ saves mankind not by dispensing with the law, but by fulfilling it and then transcending it. Okay. The law is good. It must not be condemned. It must not be swept aside. It can't be. We devour each other like monsters of the deep if we had no law. The law is good. The law is not enough. And it's, if we fix on the person of Christ and what it means for Christ to save mankind, then we'll understand why the law is not enough, but also why the law has not to be abrogated but fulfilled, and what it is that goes beyond the law. And in The Merchant of Venice, the word in various forms that shows up throughout the play, the word is grace.
You'd mentioned the romances, in particular, as a place where you see the Christian Shakespeare sort of quite prominently.
Yeah, I think to fully understand, let's just take the last three plays, Cymbeline, and Winter's Tale, and The Tempest. To fully understand those three plays, you've got to set before your mind, in a prominent way, the two great feasts of the Christian year, Christmas and Easter. Because each of those plays has relationships to Christmas and Easter.
Huh.
In The Winter's Tale, at the end of The Winter's Tale, you view what is what looks to you like an apparent transformation of a stone statue into a living human being. Awake, arise, be stone no more. But the irony is that the person who is stone no more is not the person who you're looking at there as if in the form of a statue, but the king who had condemned her, his own wife, to death for supposed infidelity. That king has undergone 16 years of penance. It's that king whose heart that had turned to stone is brought to life again over the course of these years of penitence. I mean, there are motifs of resurrection and what we see visually as a kind of raising from the dead all through the play. And The Winter's Tale. The passage from the deadness of winter to spring, right? In the depth of winter, in the darkest night of the year, right? That so many of the English carols emphasize this, that Christ is born into the world when the world is dark, right? When the world is dark and cold. I mean, even Christina Rossetti, 300 years later, water like a stone. Okay? Snow had fallen, snow on snow, snow on snow, in the deep midwinter long ago. There's a movement from a world of death to a world of grace and life. Not to say that the world still is really perfect. It's not. It's going to be full of all kinds of problems. But it's a living world.
This isn't really a devil's advocate question, I don't think, but so it occurred to me in reviewing these plays that you'd sent us, these are ones where there's particularly strong Christian themes, that in Shakespeare's plays there's also a lot of pagan elements as well.
But the pagan elements are there as, they're not there as paganism. They're there as literary devices that have been accepted by all kinds of Christian poets for hundreds and hundreds of years.
Sure. Okay. So they're more superficial garnish as opposed to.
Yeah, everybody took them that way.
Sure.
So they're not symbols of anything.
So in The Winter's Tale, for instance,
they're symbols, but they're not to be taken in any serious pagan.
With a deeper. No. I was not suggesting that Shakespeare is a pagan per se, but I mean, you could imagine sort of secular commentators today saying, well, The Winter's Tale, it's common to many religions, the idea of going from winter to spring and from death to life and so on.
All the Christian needs to say is, okay? And why should grace not build upon nature?
Good.
Right? You're telling me something I don't know? And then if they really step into it, if they say, Easter is only Easter because it's springtime. Yep.
Yeah, right.
Excuse me, no, but we know exactly when Jesus was crucified because it was the Jewish feast there, okay?
Right,
so we know what time of year it was.
Right.
So it's not piggybacking upon some spring pagan holiday or anything like that.
Yeah. Well, and you mentioned sort of grace building on nature.
Yeah. And
so, I mean, nature worship and so on is obviously big in pagan religions, but also, in Christian philosophy and theology, there's a robust philosophy of nature, of the natural world and of human nature and of natural law. Yeah. So does Shakespeare have a philosophy of nature or sort of a particular view of nature?
Yeah.
And where does that come out?
All of nature is soaked with the goodness of God, right? God created all these things. These things are good. You don't find in Shakespeare references to natural things that are treated with, a certain contempt, or the ocean is only a bunch of water. You don't get that. Tree is only a tree. You don't get that. Okay. Nature is deeply mysterious because it's the creation of God, and God works His providence in and through the life and the action of nature. This is why things that are particularly wicked in Shakespeare are called unnatural.
Right.
And why, for instance, in Macbeth, the wickedness is associated with perversions of nature and disruptions in nature. Right. So when Macbeth kills King Duncan and assumes the throne, two of the Scottish lords later on make note. We got problems with nature. There are storms, there are bad harvests of it. It's like nature itself is sick with the sin of this king, right? The ocean, according to Ariel in The Tempest, the ocean itself has heaved up the men of sin, Antonio Sebastian and King Alonso. You men of sin, you amongst all men being unfit to live. So the very ocean cannot bear your presence, but chucked you up, okay? Hath cast up, and the word cast there means puke. hath cast up you, and upon this island, where man doth not inhabit, you mongst men being most unfit to live. Shakespeare believed that. Lear's in Macbeth, right? The unnaturalness of what Macbeth is going to do. We already see it in the three weird sisters, right, whose sex is ambiguous. They're old women, but they have facial hair, and the unnaturalness of that, clear sign to everybody in the audience. These people have given themselves over to thoroughly wicked ways. These are evil. It's not natural.
So would that have been common in that day, not just in Shakespeare, but the use of the word unnatural in a moral sense?
Yeah, absolutely. That was the common sense of the word unnatural. So if you were a child and you threw your father out, that's unnatural, right? Didn't mean uncommon. It meant a violation of what you are supposed to be by your very nature as a human being. And you're supposed to revere your elders, even when he's a crotchety, somewhat annoying old man like Lear. It is unnatural for you to cast him out. Lock your door, shut your door against him. You would not shut your door against a dog on a night like this, but your own father, an old man. Unnatural, right? So Shakespeare, for Shakespeare, the world of nature is thoroughly moral. And in that sense, he's not different from the great medieval poets like Dante and Chaucer.
Well, let's maybe we can talk for a little bit about King Lear, if you'll indulge me.
Oh yeah.
And we talked about we've been talking about nature and Shakespeare's views of nature, but we didn't really talk about human nature. So I mean, that might be. I think that there's a lot about human nature in Lear, but
and nature too.
But any Christian themes, I guess, that you see in King Lear.
Yeah. Okay. So Lear. This is why people who you'll get all upset about patriarchy are like people who bring fire extinguishers in our time. They're like people who bring fire extinguishers to a flood, right? I mean, the last thing that you have to worry about in our time is that patriarchy is going to go overboard, you know? In fact, what Shakespeare shows more often than not is that fathers fail in their duty by neglect more often than by tyranny or cruelty. And Lear likes to have his own way, and he's old, and he'd rather not govern the kingdom. He'd rather be like a child again and crawl unburdened toward death. Now, Shakespeare, like Dickens, was also deeply influenced by those passages in the Gospels that have to do with children. Okay? Cruelty to a child will always be punished most severely in Shakespeare. And male unchastity never goes unpunished either. All things, right? So Lear is essentially saying, I want to have the irresponsibility of a small child. But he's not a small child, he's an 80-year-old man. And he's king. So you're going to divide his kingdom. And this invites civil war. Okay? The two daughters are bad women, but his decision to essentially set the three of them against each other gives freer play to their wickedness in the case of the two elder daughters. And it's quite unnecessary, right? And it's childish, but not childlike. He will, when he goes out of his mind later in the play, he's not in his right senses. Cordelia, the good and dutiful daughter, the youngest of the three, refers to him as this child-changed king. And there's the key. This king, we know that this king will be saved his soul will be right again when, in fact, he becomes childlike again. And it will happen, and we will see him at the very end of the play, we will see him as a royal personage. Art thou the king, says Gloucester. Lear is still out of his mind. This is like Act 4. Every inch a king. He's every inch a king now, because even though his mind is going, he hasn't yet met up with his daughter Cordelia again. His mind is unclear, is foggy, but he has a deeper moral insight than he ever possessed before, especially when it comes to mercy. He sees through the pretensions of place, status, power. He's kingly, and he's an old man in his underwear, basically, out in the middle of the forest, trapping rabbits and weaving flowers to put around his hair. Art thou the king, says Gloucester, because Gloucester's eyes have been put out. He can't see. You got a blind man and a madman. And Lear says, every inch a king. And for the first time in the play, it may be true. Other playwrights didn't do these things. Shakespeare did them all the time. Did them all the time. Cordelia, when she returns to England late in the play, she returns because the news has gotten to her in France what has happened to her father, what her sisters have done to her father. She's arrived in England with an army from France. And she refers to him. He's not present in the scene, but she says, "Oh, my dear father, it is thy business I must be about." Right?
Yeah.
Hey, secular critics. First, do you not understand what those words mean? And second, do you really not understand how deeply they would be felt by everybody who is listening?
So, and just because our audience may not be exactly the same as that audience, when Cordelia says, "It's my father's business I need to be about," that's Jesus saying.
That's Jesus in the temple, the boy Jesus in the temple. Why did you seek me? Did you not know I must be about my father's business? And when they bring Lear, they got Lear in and he's asleep. And they're trying to bring him back to his senses. The doctor is there, and the doctor has given him certain drugs. He's lying there peacefully, and music is played. Always a symbol of order in the world made by God, natural order. Music is played. Music is restorative. Music is healing. And Lear awakes and he sees Cordelia. And he thinks that she is a spirit, that he is dead. And he thinks that he doesn't belong in any place where there should be a beautiful spirit. He thinks he belongs elsewhere. And she says, no, I'm not a spirit. I have not been myself. I don't know where I have gotten, because they've dressed him now in better. I don't know where I have gotten these clothes. And I think that you must be my daughter, Cordelia. He begs her for forgiveness, and she says, your sisters, your sisters, I do remember, had no cause to hate me, but you had cause. And she says, no cause, no cause. They finally lead him off the stage, and he says, forgive me, I am old and foolish. He's a child. He has become a child. And
Childlike, not childish.
Right. Not lost his marbles. When we see him again next time on stage, although he is childlike, he resumes a fatherly and protective role for Cordelia. And he says, they're caught, they're going to prison. And we won't worry about that. We'll sing like two birds in the cage, you and me. The final scene, I'll let people read King Lear.
Sure.
But Lear will appear on stage with Cordelia, so to speak.
This has been a pleasure, Tony. I'm wondering, and this might, I don't want to break the spell if think about King Lear, but it's very moving, and it's a very somber play. I wonder if we can just maybe to lighten the mood here at the end, if you can give your answer, which you gave wonderfully in the email I forwarded to you, to the question. We're going to return all the way back to the question of bawdy humor. So to those who might feel a little uncomfortable with, and you'll hear the explanations. You talked about him growing up in this sort of theologically charged atmosphere, but then he had to make a living, and of course he had to have the common people wanting to fill the stadium, and they would have liked the off-color humor and so on. But if you're a young Christian person wanting to keep yourself and your mind more or less pure and so on, and it just sort of makes you uncomfortable, or it feels like it lessens the experience of who's supposed to be a great writer and thinker for you. What would you say to the young Christian who's uncomfortable with that, the bawdiness of Shakespeare?
I would say, when things have gotten really bad in your culture, mirth goes out the window, and you can't have this because you don't have what's bawdy now. You have what's sleazy, raunchy, edgy, harsh, mirthless.
Yeah.
But since the presumption, even if people fell afoul of it, okay, the presumption is of innocence and the moral law. You're not married, you shouldn't be doing that there. With that presumption in place, you have space cleared out for some merrymaking. So, for instance, at the end of The Merchant of Venice, it's not a Shylock scene. It's a scene with two young married couples, okay? And at one point, the whole play has been about, wagering, risking everything, and so on. And Graziano, who's been kind of a live wire throughout, he's Bassanio's. Bassanio's the principal male character in the play. He wins the hand of Portia. That's their marriage that's at the center of the play. Actually, it's three young married couples, but Bassanio and Portia, and Graziano is the name of his friend. And his friend is full of mirth and is a little bit of a live wire and maybe sometimes not too polite. But we like him, okay? I mean, he's not got this great moral vision, but we like him. Yeah. And he doesn't do anything bad in the play, right? And the name suggests grace, Graziano.
Oh, yeah.
And Bassanio has said to him, Graziano says, "Can I come with you when you woo Portia at Belmont?" And Bassanio says, Graziano, "Yeah, you can come with me." Okay, you can come with me. But you gotta behave yourself, Graziano. When we're together here, then it's okay. But he says, "I'll tell you what, I will swear only every other word." And no, I'll be just like a church mouse. And he does, in fact, behave himself. But now, of course, they're married and they're merrymaking, and Graziano says, "Hey, we'll lay a wager on them at 10 ducats for the first who gets the first son."
Yeah.
And Nerissa, his young wife, says, "What? And stake down?" Right? Put your stake down on the table. Stake down. Grazio says, stake down, you'll never win that bet. Right? And this is fine.
Yeah.
Okay? But it's a sort of bumptious, I call it mirth, joy's hillbilly cousin.
Right.
So this is kind of like
No offense to the hillbillies out there.
a good hillbilly moment.
Yeah.
Venice style.
So a distinction between sleaziness and bawdiness, always.
Yeah.
And that it's precisely in cultures that have lost the sacred and wonder and so on, that all you have is sleaziness. Whereas in cultures that can worship and that can do have objective
and where the
truth
presumption
and
is that boys and girls do not do certain things, that means that they can enjoy a lot of fun together. Yeah. And that's a fact. That's a fact. All you need to do is watch how people behave before the sexual revolution. They give themselves away in their body language and their attitude towards people of the opposite sex. You see it in like game show, What's My Line? My wife and I watch all the time. You know, some good-looking young guy comes up as a contestant, and Arlene Francis, who is very happily married, says, she'll make a comment, and the man will make a comment, a beautiful woman, and it's all part of the banter. Right. It's part of the fun of being boys and girls. Yeah. That fun is almost entirely obliterated in our society right now.
Yeah, yeah. And so, in our desire to stay pure, as it were, we've got to also not take ourselves too seriously. I mean, I think C.S. Lewis said this about the bedroom, but
that's right. He said it in the screw tape letters too.
That's right, in the screw tape letters. So lest we become Angelos ourselves, so to speak.
Yeah, it's no fun being Angelo.
Yeah,
I don't think Italians have too much problem with this, but it would be good if Christians generally understood the distinction and remembered that you can have purity and mirth together.
Yeah.
And it's those other people now who don't believe in purity. They have no fun. They may have excitement sometimes, and not even much of that anymore, but they're not having fun. They don't actually enjoy. I mean, when was the last time you saw, outside of certain Christian enclaves, when was the last time you saw a boy and a girl holding hands? Where are the boys and girls at your typical high school teasing each other in a flirtatious but innocent way? Where is it? It's all been destroyed by the sexual revolution.
But you can find it in Shakespeare.
Oh, you can find it all over the place in Shakespeare. Why should it even be male or female if not for the fun that there's this other sex over there? Yeah. Even if you're not married, there's banter, there's appreciation, there's gratitude. Yeah. There's annoyance sometimes and misunderstandings, sure. But that's, hey, what are you going to do? We live. We're people, we're flawed, and we live with each other. But there's fun. Yeah. And there's no fun out there. Not much fun out there, but there's a lot of fun in Shakespeare.
And here. Purity and mirth. That's a good place to end.
Yep.
Thank you, Tony. It's been a pleasure, and we're gonna have to do this again so that we can have you back.
Yeah, we'll do this with Milton sometimes.
All right. It's a deal.
All right.
Thanks.
Thanks.